This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hall & Wilcox's cyber podcast, Cyber Zone. I'm Eden Winokur, a partner and head of cyber at Hall & Wilcox. For Season 1, Episode 3, I'm thrilled to be joined by Rhys Ryan, a leading crisis communications expert and the CEO of Porter Novelli Australia. Today, we're talking about crisis communications in cyber incidents, how to get them right. Rhys, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me, Eden. Great to be with you.
Excellent. So, you're one of the leading cyber crisis communications experts in Australia. Looking at it sort of quite broadly at a high level, how do you think the likes of Optus and Medibank have handled their crisis communications to date?
Yeah, look, I mean, we can only sort of look at it from the point of view of everybody else, what we've read in the paper, what we hear around the traps. And to be honest, while there's been obvious issues with the way that they've handled it, actually, knowing what I know, knowing what you know, they probably haven't done as poorly as some people think. It's just that you have to understand that when you're a household name as a business, when your business suffers this sort of incident or crisis, it's fantastic fodder for news organisations. So headlines with Optus and Medibank in them get clicks. And so this has been incredibly salacious for the news media. And the problem is you then have hundreds of very well-informed journalists wading into a situation. Unfortunately, while they're well informed about many things, many of them are not well informed about the ins and outs of a data breach situation. And so you get a lot of uninformed commentary. And then in this case, you're getting political stakeholders under pressure to make comment, who some of whom have, varying levels of knowledge about what's going on. So the nightmare scenario for any business, and the incidents where we find the most difficulty in getting alignment with our clients on, is when the public or the stakeholders around you become aware of a data breach when you don't know the full extent of it, and you might not know for days or weeks. In some cases, you may never know the full extent of it, but everyone's screaming at you and demanding definitive answers. And I think that's probably where they made some significant missteps in their response. Perhaps they didn't have the right expertise on board in the early hours of the incident, but giving definitive statements when you are still in the early stages of a forensic investigation, I think that's what really might have tripped them up in this case, because then you appear to be changing your story when in fact you're actually just updating the situation. But yeah, I think as household names and publicly listed companies working in healthcare, it's an incredibly high stakes situation. There's so many conflicting pressures on the business and so little time. I'm sure there's a lot happened that we're not aware of. So I have some sympathy for them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, that's why, when we talk to clients about incident response, one of the first things that we always recommend is to call us straight away. So that, yeah. Really, that means that if we were to receive a call from the likes of an Optus, if we had received that call once they were aware of it, one of the first things I would have recommended is to call you and bring you in, Rhys, to bring in your expertise to help manage that communications channel. And yeah, obviously we don't know exactly what happened behind closed doors, but something's happened which has resulted in certain statements being made, which I think with the benefit of hindsight appear to be unfortunate. And that really leads me into, it's a great segue into my next question, which is, if you look at the Optus breach, the CEO very quickly said that it was a sophisticated attack. And that word sophisticated has been jumped on by the media, who have rounded up a series of experts who have refuted that statement. And that position's sort of consistent with my discussions with cybersecurity experts. And then the Minister for Cybersecurity, she jumped on that comment as well and just flat out said it was wrong. And so, I think Optus have had people scoring runs off me throughout the process by calling it sophisticated. And then in the Medibank breach, its CEO said on the 17th of October, and we're recording this on Friday, 28 October, but on the 17th of October, the CEO said that we can say, and then they use the word definitively, that there's no evidence that customer data has been removed from our systems, only to 9 days after that statement come out and say that all 4 million customers have had their data exposed in the incident. So why did these CEOs get it so wrong? And how does making these types of statements impact the organization's reputation?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, the level of reputation loss has a massive business impact. You know, Medibank's share price dropped about 20%. They've wiped about $2 billion of, shareholders' value off its market cap. And so the market there is essentially pricing in the likely loss of trade the company will see in coming months and years. I mean, would you join Medibank tomorrow? You might think twice after seeing all the news. I mean, it has a massive business impact. And in a way, compared to some of the high-profile breaches we've worked on, that's getting off lightly. Sometimes it can be existential for a business altogether, because the impact is there's loss of trust. You're handling something so important on behalf of your customers, stakeholders, consumers, and medical records are, the highest of the high. You're holding their baby, essentially. There's a loss of perception of competence that comes with this sort of thing, and the realization that we're handing over a lot of data to these companies and not really getting much in return for that, which leaves a bit of a bad taste in our mouth. So the impact is really quite powerful, and you're seeing that more and more people coming out in the media saying, hang on, why are we giving all of our data to these companies? What are we getting back from it? And that's been a long-term conversation as the kind of convenience for data kind of trade has continued. But I think from my point of view, CEOs get it wrong, or business leaders get it wrong usually for two reasons. And the first is probably because they're wading into a data breach with very little experience or preparation for it, even though I'm sure these companies do, simulations and have plans, etc. But, they're motivated sometimes by issues other than reputation. Maybe they're receiving advice from legal professionals or other non-specialists who might be, prioritizing other issues above the transparency they need. But I think they just got it wrong in their messaging. To your point, they tried to get out there quickly, but they were far too definitive in their statements. And you're dealing with media and stakeholders who are a bit unsophisticated in these matters and don't really understand how complicated it can be to unpick a data breach that's been carefully, the tracks have been carefully covered by a threat actor. So my sort of thinking on it is you just never say a single sentence that doesn't include the message, but it's important to stress that our investigation is ongoing. Or right now we don't see any evidence, but our investigation is ongoing. Like, it should be never, should never be saying a single sentence, because that can be taken out of context and just dropped into a media article. And having said that, I think companies try to do the right thing and continually update the market, update stakeholders, and then they're taken out of context and accused of changing their story. So I think if you're going to be transparent about it, that's good, but I think you've got to be extremely careful about the actual language you use. And then finally, I think they underplayed the criminal nature of these attacks. I think if somebody broke into a secure Optus data center and blew up the safe and stole your data, you'd be upset, but you wouldn't feel that badly towards Optus. And I think while you can't pretend you're the victim here, you can position yourself somewhat as the co-victim of a serious crime alongside your customers. It's not, Optus and Medibank didn't do this to their customers. It was done to them. And I think, in that case, it was actually really helpful when the Cybersecurity Minister, Claire O'Neill, called the Medibank hackers criminals and called the attack a dog act. I think that was actually quite helpful for them, because, it does help to position them as the victim of a crime. And as I said, I think there's a real limit to how much you can play victim when you've lost people's data. But at the end of the day, it was stolen from you. You didn't just, drop it out of your pocket.
I think you make a number of really great points there, and a number of sort of interesting points that I wanted to sort of comment on. I mean, one, that sort of the investigation is ongoing. In fairness to the Medibank CEO, that was the language that was used in some of the earlier communications. It was just the word definitively, this shows just how, I mean, you got lawyers and communications experts talking about the importance of words. So that's not a huge surprise, but, like just a single word like sophisticated or definitively, these words are so important when it comes to the way that we communicate with stakeholders in response to cyber incidents. And we're talking about high pressure situations here, but nevertheless, that's why it is so important to have the right people on board who can give you the right perspective on how certain words will be perceived and how they can come back to bite at certain points.
Yeah, and it sounds like lawyers and comms people quibbling, but when you say something like when did you know? It's really important to be able to define what you mean by know. If you know that something's been accessed, but you don't know what's been taken, and it's in the range of millions of records, then you could get in real trouble if you go out there and be very definitive about it. So it is really difficult to sort of determine what you know when you knew it. And and then to be able to communicate that and make sure that what you're communicating is accurate. So I think it is using the right words is much more important than it is in any other situation.
And I think a couple other points that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on. One is sort of, we're talking about the way that companies collect our data, and it's a really hot topic. I mean, there's been just this week, the Attorney General has put forward some proposed amendments to the Privacy Act, and this amendment seeks to massively increase the maximum penalty that the Privacy Commissioner can seek to impose against companies to $50 million or 3 times the benefit derived. And there's even potentially a 30% of an adjusted turnover measure, which is an enormous amount that companies can be penalised. And so there is, I think, going to be a real reckoning when it comes to the way that companies look at what data they look at, the sort of life cycle of data. And I mean, there was that saying a few years ago, sort of data is the new oil. And then, and then you had Alistair McGibbon, who's a very well-known and respected person in the sort of cybersecurity space, compare data to asbestos. And I don't necessarily agree with that characterization. I wouldn't call it asbestos, but I do think that companies really do need to have a long think about the way that their data life cycle plays out from the moment they're collecting to the moment they delete or de-identify it in order to comply with the Privacy Act. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. And you also mentioned simulations. My observation is that not enough companies have run simulations properly or really game planned for these types of scenarios. I mean, I'm encouraging all companies around Australia to undertake that type of training, bringing in people like myself and the team at Hall & Wilcox, bringing in IT experts, bringing in comms experts like yourself, Reece, and the team at Porter Novelli, to actually sit down and spend half a day with the leadership team to go through, how would your company respond to this type of incident, and make sure that they've got the correct playbook in place so that in those first hours after an incident happens, they're not saying the wrong thing that's going to lead to people jumping on and attacking them or share prices dropping the way that we've seen. So
I couldn't agree more. I actually spent about 6 hours in a data breach simulation session yesterday with a large Australian manufacturing company, and it was designed to test their crisis response, their business continuity plan, their data breach response plan. And it was really good because we found a lot of problems. You can't just have a crisis plan. You need a specific plan for response to cyber incidents, because if you have to unplug your system and create an air gap essentially, and you've had a ransomware attack take down your Active Directory, you can't even call each other. So, you go, we'll get a Teams meeting going with the crisis response crisis response team. And the next question is, well, how do we tell people to come to a meeting? We can't email them, we can't call them, and then someone starts talking about WhatsApp, and the legal people in the room are saying, I'm not sure we should be doing. So it is, it's a really valuable exercise right down to brass tacks. And for this company, it would have shut down all the manufacturing, all the logistics, storage, refrigeration, they can't guarantee food safety, etc. So it when you get locked up, it really does lock you up, and having contingencies in place that's what really stands between you having a catastrophic response to a data breach and a decent response to a data breach. Having workarounds, because everyone's going to start asking you questions really quickly, and if you can't even make a phone call, you're just not going to be able to respond properly.
And that's the whole point of these simulations. It's not to focus on what hasn't been put in place previously. It's really about being ready and prepared to handle the risks that are currently faced. So really pleased to hear that the client you worked with has undertaken that training. And, again, I sort of would strongly encourage more and more companies to undertake this training and look at it sort of holistically, look at it as, there's 3 pillars here. There's the legal issues, there's the IT issues, and there's the communications issues. They're really your core 3 issues when it comes to response. So in my view, the best way to do that is to integrate those 3 together and then work through these types of simulations. I wanted to move on to another question, which is really around timing. So I think Optus was criticised, I saw, by a number of journalists for taking literally 1 day to communicate with the public after it became aware of the incident. I mean, I saw TV, radio, you name it, people were jumping down their throats for literally waiting 1 day. But as we both know very well, in practice, it's often difficult to communicate immediately after becoming aware of a suspected incident, or even when you know that you've had one, because there are a lot of unknown facts and investigations are underway. How challenging is it for you from a communications perspective to balance being quick to inform customers about an incident and then making sure that what customers are told is accurate and isn't going to cause them too much concern? How do you generally deal with this kind of tension?
Yeah, and as I said, that's when we're called in. So when you have a breach, that you'll generally always have your forensic and IT folks on it, and then legal advice, etc. But when we get called in, it's usually because there is that awful trough of uncertainty when you've discovered there's been some form of breach, and when you can actually accurately notify affected individuals. That time can be weeks or months. We have a breach that was detected last November for a client. They're still rolling out communications because they keep finding more evidence of access files, and it's a massive job. So I think the tricky part is you've also got to balance communications with stakeholders and what you're required to do under the Act to notify those people who are affected. And then you've also got obviously tensions when a threat actor makes it public, or for some other reason it's obvious to everyone that you've had a cyber incident. At the same time, it becomes obvious to you, particularly if you're a publicly traded company. So I saw in a media story this week that Rachel Falk, the CEO of the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, said that the MedLab breach that just came out the other day, that they should have gone public immediately. They obviously held on some news for quite a long time, in a number of months, I think. But she said, quote, "My view is as soon as you know you have a breach and you fall under the Privacy Act, even if you're not sure, disclose. That's the sort of expectation we're seeing now. But the problem is that if you know you have a breach and you fall under the Privacy Act, you don't know though, because you maybe some individuals are affected, but you don't know how many. And if you're a publicly traded company like Medibank, you can't just go out there sort of having a guess at it. And you might know you've lost data, and you've verified with a threat actor that they really have exfiltrated data, but you don't know exactly what data. And we had one a while back where hundreds of thousands of records have been stolen, but in the end, when we finally got to the end of it, only 23 people had actually suffered a notifiable breach. The rest was all just things like names and addresses that you can get in the white pages. So I think that media won't necessarily be responsible with that information if you go out and say we've lost millions of records, but we're pretty sure it's only a few people have been affected. So in terms of like what we do to deal with that tension where there's a gap between what we know and when we'll know it, is the best advice I can give is to flood the zone. You've got to constantly update the regular media, update your website, update your socials, and having with extreme discipline about what you say. So investigations ongoing, we will continue to update every 2 hours. We've updated, the relevant regulatory authorities. We've contacted law enforcement. We're working with forensic experts. Basically, the more information you can put out there, the better, because it means that you're not asking media or other stakeholders to fill the vacuum with what they might imagine to be the case, or other pundits. So that's our goal, is making sure you've got as much information as you can out there all the time. And then the last thing I'd say is you've got to be prepared for the inbound. Once you do that, if you go out before you know exactly what the truth is, you might get thousands of calls an hour. So one of the things we recommend to large companies is that they should have a call center partner ready to roll that can be briefed and stood up in a couple of hours, so that when you get thousands of inbound, it can be diverted to a third party that can handle those and give people basic information.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, two points that come out of that for me. You made the point about sort of, we're talking about what's notifiable under the Privacy Act. I think, it's helpful to stop and clarify that. It's not every data breach means that you need to notify, whether it's the Privacy Commissioner or the individual. Under the Privacy, the current law in Australia is that not every data breach is actually notifiable. It's not a legal obligation to notify about everything. So, and you sort of referred to the white pages before, and I think for the listeners, it's sort of helpful to take note of that. If your name and email address is caught up in a data breach, depending on the circumstances, there's a chance that the impacted company doesn't need to tell you. For me personally, my name and email address is on the firm's website. So if anyone wants it, please feel free to go and look it up. But if there's a data breach and it involves my name and my email address, the company probably doesn't need to tell me that, because anyone can get that from publicly available information. So it's really when we start getting into more sensitive data, health records, driver's licenses, passports, that it is important to tell me so I can go and take steps to protect myself. So I think one of the challenges that I've seen and observed in my time working in this space is that, and I think you alluded to it before, it's, a company might know that they've had a breach. I had one where we had millions of records that had been impacted, but the vast majority of records impacted were, just again, sort of basic name and addresses. But you don't know that on day one. It can take weeks to figure that out. So you come out publicly and say, we've had this incident. You get the flood of inbound calls wanting to know, what's happened and what of my information have you got. That information is not necessarily readily available and at the fingertips of someone to be able to give that to you straight away. And so it's a real challenge that I've often seen companies grapple with. And I agree with you that sometimes you do need to engage with external call center services to take the pressure off the team who ultimately will be receiving these inbound calls, because it can be a very high pressure situation and can lead to a lot of fatigue for companies, particularly on the big ones.
Yeah, and I think that part of that stems from the fact that when people think about a threat actor taking information, they kind of think that they're going in and selecting an Excel spreadsheet full of contact details, when in actual fact, it's more like a ram raid. You just come in and grab a huge amount of data and just, exfiltrate that off the system. And it's a whole mix of things. And so it's all fragmented. There's bits of this, bits of that. It can take hundreds of people many, many days, weeks, months to go through it line by line and actually ascertain what's notifiable. And I think that's where the expectation clunk comes with the average punter out there. And fair enough, they would expect it all to be a bit more organized than that, but it's an absolute mess. And that's what's very hard to communicate.
It really is. I mean, there is this real perception. If you go to sort of down to the pub, there's probably an expectation that everyone's data is neat and structured and really easy to figure out. Why can't we just sort of figure out, like in the click of a finger, how what data is impacted and how many Medicare cards have been impacted? It's just not that simple.
Just use AI, right?
Yeah, that's right. Maybe in the near future we'll be a lot smarter at how we deal with this. And I do think, sort of we joke about it, but I do think that we will get there. It's a matter of time. So I wanted to ask another question, which came up in the Optus breach. A number of customers were pretty frustrated about finding out about the incident in the media. And I know we've actually talked about this before when we've worked on matters before. And it's really about sort of the order in which stakeholders should be notified or should be advised about what's happening. And so, appreciate that not all matters are the same. You can't really have a rule that applies every single time, but just generally, what do you recommend in terms of the order of how you communicate with key stakeholders?
Yeah, it's interesting because the people who are upset about finding out about the breach in the media, they found out that there had been a breach. They didn't find out that their details had been necessarily taken. So it's sort of an interesting one. Sometimes the expectation's sky high at the moment, and that will remain so for probably a number of months. I'd say our general rule of thumb is if you do the right thing as a human by other humans, the media will treat you reasonably well. So our general order of things is you've got to tell your staff of what's going on so that if they are asked, they can actually answer credibly, relevant staff members. Then you've got to tell stakeholders. So, you've got to update regulatory authorities and law enforcement or whoever else it might be. You may have contractual obligations to tell customers, B2B customers, and all those things probably need to happen before you go and tell media and consumers that you've had a breach. In a perfect world, it would be, in that order and notify and affected individuals before media. But when it's sort of, sometimes these things all land at once. But I think generally we would say, tell your people, tell your stakeholders, tell affected individuals, and then tell media. But if you do all those first three right, you don't really need to communicate with media because everyone else will on your behalf. Yeah, but I think that's a general rule. I always, we work with media all the time, but I'm always telling our clients in a range of different scenarios, let's focus on doing the right thing. And as Joe Biden's so fond of saying, let's get caught trying. Let's get caught doing the right thing rather than trying to worry about reputation first. papering over things. Just focus on doing the right thing, and then you don't have to worry about saying the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. And I know another one that that I always sort of mention, because sometimes it's forgotten, is just employees, just making sure that employees are currently informed, and they are often the mouthpiece for your company. So making sure that they've got a sort of single source of truth, whether it's sort of a statement page that covers all the details, so that we're all people. So when they go home from work, they've got friends, they've got family, they'll know that you work at Optus, let's just say. It's important that they've got a single message that they can then communicate out to the world as someone from the inside.
Especially these large companies, like everybody knows someone who works at Telstra. Everyone knows someone who works at Qantas or Jetstar. Like, so you just going to text your mate and say, hey, what's the deal? And if they've got the right answer, instead of having to rely on, say, one media outlet, you've got tens of thousands of narrow cast media outlets at your disposal. And if you communicate with them respectfully and give them the right info, then it can be really powerful.
Absolutely. So the final question is going to focus on sort of pre-incident. And so, really what we've been talking about so far is how to respond to an incident coming in for a crisis. We did do a little bit of talk about sort of simulations and training, but I want to focus more in on that sort of pre-incident stage. What do you recommend? What are some of the recommendations that you make to companies throughout Australia from a communications perspective to help them be prepared in case they have a cyber incident?
Yeah, so I remember I was speaking at an event on a panel a couple of years ago about this, and there was a forensic professional there, and he said, they always say an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. And he said, well, I'm the pound of cure, and we don't walk in the door for less than $250,000. And I just thought, what people don't really understand is how expensive it can get if you're not prepared and you don't have the right things in place. So from my point of view, I'd say every company should be exploring their options when it comes to insurance. Cyber incident response, as I said earlier, when we in our conversation, you should have a specific data breach response plan alongside your crisis management plan, and you should have regular simulations to test that plan, because you test it this year, in 12 months' time, there'll be changes to your exec team and your board. So you've got to keep updating that, making sure people are ready to go and understand their responsibilities. So I'd say, insurance plan and simulation. And then the fourth thing I'd say is you should have relationships in place with specialists. So a legal specialist firm, not just your external counsel, but a firm that actually understands the space. A relationship with a forensic IT partner, with comm specialists like ourselves, and a call center operator, so that these things can all be stood up at a moment's notice. That might be something that's facilitated by your insurance company, but even so, it's worth making sure you understand all those relationships, because when these things happen, it's inevitably on Christmas Day or at 4 a.m. on a Sunday or some really inconvenient time when you don't want to be starting that process then. And I think the last thing I'd say is, there are some companies that just need to worry about this a lot more than others. If you handle a lot of sensitive data, like people's health records, if your business is sort of a data-led business, like you're an e-commerce company, and the only thing that stakeholders and customers expect from you is protection of their data. If you're a B2B company that has a lot of competitors that have a very similar offering to you, then if you have a data breach, you can just be switched off by your customers and they can just move to a competitor. So I think the threat actors are aware of this too, and that's the sort of company they target. So if you feel a sort of profile that they would like a ransomware operator thinks is a good target, then you really want to make sure you're buttoned up, because if you haven't been the subject of a ransomware attack yet, you're just on the list for this year, I'd say.
I think that's right. And I couldn't agree more with all of those recommendations, especially sort of having that plan. I mean, imagine you have an incident and you've got a pre-written communication that can be sent out. You've got to fill in some details, but you've already got the template ready to go, and you're not scrambling to get everyone together in the heat of the moment, because you've already got the plan, you've already got the document, and then you can execute the plan. It's just such a better way to respond compared to the alternative.
Yeah, and like you think about whenever we've worked together, you can call me and we can have a team ready to respond, already writing messaging within an hour, because we've got a relationship set up. Whereas if you just had to call me and I didn't know who you were, and then we had to start a relationship and do paperwork and all that stuff, it takes a really long time, even if you're doing it extremely expeditiously. So I I can't stress enough the importance of having those relationships ready to roll.
That's exactly right. And I think on that, you mentioned sort of insurance, and, I do a lot of work with cyber insurers. And one of the reasons they've had such great success is that they've set up these panels of experts who, like yourselves, like myself, who have dealt with these types of issues for a number of years. And so, the cyber insurers do have these panels that are pre-vetted, that have been approved, and that's great. A lot of companies don't have cyber insurance either, for whatever reason, but, maybe we'll see how that changes over the coming years. But notwithstanding, at this current point in time, a number of companies don't have that cyber insurance. So we're actually, working with a number of clients and providing that sort of service to corporates directly as well. So not even just through insurance, where we'll provide that sort of, panel response to help companies who might not have the insurance either yet or have made an informed business decision that they don't want to take it out. And then the other thing I think to note is that, companies can, go to their cyber insurer if they've got the insurance. If there's a particular, and I agree with your comment that you really need to work with experts. This is a specialist area. You don't go to a general commercial lawyer or a property lawyer for this type of work. It is very specialist. You can, if you've got an existing relationship with someone who's got the expertise, you can speak to your insurer and ask for them to pre-approve the use of certain vendors. So if you, that's, I think, a message for companies. If you are interested, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to have that discussion with you about how that can work in practice. Reece, that was fantastic. Big thank you for all of your insights and contributions and expertise. Really terrific discussion from, to the listeners. Obviously, thank you for listening, but you've heard today from really one of, if not the leading communications expert when it comes to cyber crises in Australia. So we trust that you found the information useful in today's episode, and please feel free to reach out to myself or Reece if you have any questions about anything discussed today or generally when it comes to cyber and crisis management. You can find my details on the Hall & Wilcox website, hallandwilcox.com.au, and you can find Reece's details on his website, porternovelli.com.au. Both of us are on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and follow our podcast on whatever platform you like to listen to. And you can also subscribe on our website to be notified of new episodes. Thanks so much, everyone.